Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Tamana Wash Process Colombia from Tim Wendelboe. And there's the bag right there. And Tim Wendelboe, based out of Oslo, Norway. And this is our second ever full bag review of one of Tim Wendelboe's coffees, having recently reviewed their Cachaça, a wash processed Kenya. And I'd say of these two coffees, I probably had slightly higher expectations for this coffee, given that I do have a preference for washed Colombians over washed Kenyans. So it'll be interesting to see if it lived up to those expectations, as this right here is day 26. And once again, Tim Wendelboe does have a brew guide on their website. It's about a 15.4 to 1 water to coffee ratio, and they say just off boil, which I assume means some slightly higher temperatures. We went with our standard recipe, which is a 16 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit, and I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Tim Wendelboe is a Nordic Light for the roast profile. That out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 12, first impression, and the cup was a lot more lively than initially expected, as there were plenty of cleaner red fruit characteristics, but it was also surprisingly sweet. And that was consistent among both of the Tim Wendelboe coffees we had, as I did not remember them being quite as sweet as previously experienced. So it was a nice first start for both of those coffees in that sense. There was an added bit of herbality to the cup with a slightly savory aspect as well. So it was kind of funny, given that the other coffee was a Kenyan, that they were both acting somewhat in similar fashion. This one was just perhaps a little bit sweeter and left a little bit more of a positive first impression. Day 14, not quite as impressive of a cup when brewed through the Chemex, as it just feels even more savory. Almost to the level of a Kenyan, in the sense that it had so many of those red fruits in an even more pronounced sense. More robust herbals in the cup, as well as the entirety of the cup just remained really flavorful. And that was another thing about these Tim Wendelboe coffees, is that they both came out super flavorful, which is a positive thing for me. And even though the recipes call for slightly more concentrated brews, I still like it a little bit more diluted because they were already flavorful enough to begin with. Day 16, another good day to the coffee, as the red fruits continue to remain both slightly savory and quite herbal, as there's definitely a mark of this tea-like aspect to the coffee. So I believe they have a black tea flavor note listed on here, and that's where you're getting secondary savory components in addition to what feels like a slightly savory red fruit as well. So slight bit of that in the finish, but another pretty good day of this coffee. Day 17, the cup is coming out really clean on this day. It's slightly herbal with a fair bit of those red fruits, and also a fair bit of this kind of delicate craft chocolate bar, which I experienced from so many, we'll say, really light profiled South American coffees, your Perus, your Colombians, and that's very much the case that I've experienced with other Nordic coffee roasters. So it's definitely something that I was experiencing today on this day. Cup still remaining surprisingly flavorful. Day 19, tried another day through the Chemex, and once again, I'm just not able to replicate the same sort of results as I get in the V60, even with adjustments. The herbality really seems to just take prominence in the cup, while the sweeter aspects feel even more toned down. As I always say, the Chemex can giveth and taketh, and in this case, it's giving more herbals and taking away the sweeter aspects, which is not going to be a positive for me. Day 20 really just settled on the V60, as this one yielded another positive day. It was focusing on a combination of sweeter and more ripe red fruits. After a cool down, it feels very much like a raspberry dominant lemonade. Clean and defined, very well structured, and I'm continuing to see improvement in this coffee with time. That was the same thing with the Kenyan. I feel like these coffees, even though it says on the bag, consume within 3 weeks, gets better around this 3-week mark and was continuing to improve. Day 22, continuing to see great sweetness as red fruits come off in a somewhat more candied sense on this day. Slightly tart red berries with this slightly citric, acidic aspect to them. Herbality a little more pronounced as well, and I remember getting a little bit of this kind of apple acidity to the cup as well. So there was a fair bit of depth and a fair bit of unique fruit components to it as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 5 level 4, so let's go through those real quick. The cleanliness level 4, yeah, I think it's on the slightly cleaner side when compared to even that Kenyan coffee, so it definitely warrants that level 4 mark, but they're about the same, honestly, so quite nice in that aspect. Finish level 4, it did have a nice lasting finish, and it comes off very clean and even in that sense, so I really like it there. Maybe the slightly lower side of the level 4, but definitely still justified. Sweetness level 4, and that's one of the first things I said about this coffee, was it came out a lot more sweet and flavorful than I think I was initially expecting. So I really like it there on that mark. You're always off to a good start when you get the sweetness at a minimum of level 4. That's one of the prerequisites to me even liking a coffee, is that minimum level 4 mark. Acidity, level 4, and that's the contrasting aspect, is I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of acidity in coffee. Mention that all the time, and this one definitely had a fair bit of it as well. So you can see it there at the level 4 mark, definitely a fair bit of it in this cup. And then the berry fruit at a level 4, once again, this one acted very similar to the other coffee, the Kenyan coffee that we had. So definitely seeing a lot of similarities in those aspects. Florality, body, and savoriness, all scoring a level 3 as well. Florality, a little bit more of this kind of red florality as it's coming off also savory and herbal, which is interesting. And this one doesn't have quite as thick of a body as the Kenyan did, which is interesting to me, especially given the origin and the brew method that we had for this coffee. But I definitely agree with those being at the more moderate levels. Level 3 seems like a good fit for those. Mentioned there was a slight bit of this craft chocolate bar aspect to the cup, so that's why it's scoring at a level 2. But for the most part, I don't think that there's too much else worth discussing. I think that this tasting wheel is pretty straightforward, and it was actually quite an easy tasting wheel to make. I quite agree with the way that it looks on this day as well. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. So I like this coffee too. And the one thing I think I have to say about Tim Wendelboe is they offer so many coffees that aren't necessarily my preference. Like if I were to go onto Tim Wendelboe's website right now, I actually did before this video, and took a look at all their coffees, and none of them really sound like my types of coffee. And that's kind of Tim Wendelboe in a nutshell, is none of his coffees ever sound like my type of coffee, as I do tend to prefer maybe slightly more floral fruity that aren't on the red fruit side of things coffees. And that seems to be Tim Wendelboe's forte, in addition to them being a little bit more acidic and a little bit more herbal and a fair bit of savoriness in them. So I have to give Tim Wendelboe huge credit for doing a nice job with coffees that aren't necessarily my preference. Like, I've never had a Tim Wendelboe coffee that I thought I didn't like. This is another example of that, as I think I like this one a little bit more than the Kenyan coffee as well. But this is definitely not my type of coffee to begin with. I just think it's nice enough done that I enjoyed it from the first time I had it all the way until now. And I continue to see improvement in this coffee, and that's just been all of my experiences with Tim Wendelboe. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to is if you still like your lighter profiled coffees with a fair bit of the herbality, the red fruits, as well as the acidity, then this one's a nice fit, because the added sweetness that comes from it is a huge selling point to me. And I really push sweet coffees, as I think that Tim Wendelboe does a really nice job with his sweetness. And I think that's the main reason I like his coffees as much as I do, given that they're not my type of coffee, is because I always seem to get great sweetness from his coffees, which is a huge positive. Sweetness and clarity, those are prerequisites to me liking a coffee, and even if some other aspects aren't to my liking, hitting those will always at least give me a positive enough impression. I think for the most part though, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Tamana wash process Colombia from Tim Wendelboe. Thank you for watching.